White and I have gone around and around about Genesis 50 on other programs, and one of the things I notice about White's inconsistency in dealing with that passage is that he'll continue to talk about how they are judged justly because of their motivations, ignoring the fact that their motivations are likewise decreed by God. And when you push White on that, that's when it goes silent, crickets. And this is what I read from the best of the best philosophers who are confronting compatibilistic determinism, is that to say that we're free as long as we're doing what we want ignores the reason we want what we want is in accordance with what God has decreed for us to want in any given circumstance. And so whenever he appeals to Joseph's brothers and says, God intended it for good, man intended it for evil. Well, the intentions, the murderous intentions of the brothers, or the jealous intentions of the brothers, the prideful intentions of the brothers, are not from God according to Scripture. They're not from God. And yet Calvinists, at least true theistic determinists, as I understand them, are saying it is from God. Everything is from the divine decree on theistic determinism. And that's what I think Craig is pushing back against. It's certainly what provisionists as a whole are pushing back against, is that God doesn't decree, determine, even tempt men to do evil, much less causally determine it. And so for God to intend for a certain thing to happen does not mean he has to causally determine for evil creatures to do evil. He can know and use evil creatures in their already evil ways to bring about his good purposes without being the one who causally determines evil to take place.
But in the situation of what the brothers did to Joseph, God specifically says through Scripture, you meant this for evil. He does not excuse their sin. He does not say, oh, you're just puppets on a string, so it doesn't really matter. He knew what filled their hearts. He knew that God had restrained them from killing him. And yet, in the very same sentence,
he knew what filled their hearts, or he determined what filled their hearts. He knew what filled their hearts, or he decreed what would fill their hearts.
That's a great way of putting it. Exactly. It's the language.
You've got to point out these things. He continually uses provisionistic language, free will language, as if it's consistent with within his deterministic worldview. And if you're not listening for it, you won't catch it. And a lot of people don't even know to listen for it.
He says, God intended it for good and to save many alive to this day. Acts chapter 4, of where God's sovereign decree.
You want to jump on that? You want to talk?
Well, what I was going to say is, and I think this is it, is what he says. If I had no idea who James White was, and you were to play this clip and then what he's about to say and show it to me, I would think he's a Molinist. And Craig's about to point this out as well. He sounds just like a Molinist because of the language he's using, the way he's wording it. Yeah, I would have thought he was a Molinist if I hadn't known him.
He limits man's evil and accomplishes God's purpose through that evil, and that God then
God accomplishes his purpose through that evil? That sounds like me. I wrote that in my book. In fact, God doesn't cause the evil intentions of the brothers. He doesn't decree the evil intentions of the brothers. He knows and uses. The word uses is our language, not the Calvinist language. God doesn't just use anything. He decrees it. The reason that he can use a tool is because he's created the tool to be what it is on Calvinism. We just say he uses tools for his own good purpose because the tool is responsible for what they end up choosing to do because they're responsible for what motivations they act upon. They're not acting in accordance with divine decree. They're acting in accordance with their own free decision, their own responsibility within that given circumstance.
Is men not for their knowledge of a divine decree, but for acting upon the desires of their hearts. That's the basis.
See, there he goes. See, he says he judged them for acting upon the desires of their hearts without addressing why they desire that in their hearts. He ignores that issue. Every time I've brought it up in the debates, every time back and forth on Twitter, every time in our back and forth, I bring this up over and over and over again with White. Crickets every single time. Prove me wrong. Anybody who in the side chat, I think Pinko, whether there was over there, she's one of the best advocates for White. Find it for me, please, where White has ever answered that issue, because it doesn't exist as far as I'm aware. And I've got a lot of people listening to White on a regular basis looking for it. So if you can find it, let me know. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, and to pull back the onion layers a little bit more too, philosophically speaking, is and if the person isn't familiar with these issues or the Calvinistic deterministic position, I would argue, not a main point, but I would argue that Calvinism is wed to determinism or compatibilism. And compatibilism is just a soft determinism. And on compatibilism, a person's greatest desire causally determines their actions necessarily. Now, like you just pointed out, where did these desires come from? Well, if we even rewind further, it seems like White is saying that everything that is about me, he calls them gifts because he's talking in a positive light. Everything that I have are these gifts God given me, and this makes me who I am. Well, if we can translate that to say everything I'm born with was things that God gave me, and these things and desires God gave me is what caused me to be the person I am. Well, let's look at someone who claims to be born gay or homosexual or transgender. Did God give that to them? According to White, yes, he wouldn't call it a gift. And if I'm wrong, I'd like to know why, because based on what he said, if God gave this to the person, and these are what bring about the desires of the person, and if on compatibilism these desires cause you to determine their actions, then you're not going further back enough if you say, well, God's judging them for acting on the desires of their heart. Well, we need to step back further and say, and where do these desires come from? And if we rewind what White was saying, everything that we have come from God, and those are what gives our desires. So, hence, God is the author of evil, as Craig points out.
Well, if you say all things means all things with regard to the sovereign decree, that God sovereignly and unchangeably decrees all things, that would include same-sex attraction. That's a thing that's the desires of the heart of men are included within all things. And so unless Calvinists are making the caveat, God decrees whatsoever comes to pass with the exception of the pride and lustful, sinful thoughts of men and creation, then they need to make that caveat really clear, because as far as I know, they don't make that caveat. As far as I've heard from Piper and others, when asked that question, directly ask that question, in fact, they will, in the affirmative, say, yes, even God decrees your besetting sins and your desires and your choices. That's consistent across the board among leading Calvinists that I'm aware of. And so when people indicate otherwise, it seems to me they don't understand the namesake of their systematic or the leading scholars who are promoting their systematic.